James shifted his attention, focusing it entirely on Curie now. On his legs, he could feel Shida also shift. Apparently, Curie's sudden talkativeness had by now broken through her haziness as well, at least enough to get her curious. The music droned on, filling the room just loud enough to make conversations harder than necessary. Moore, Quiss, and Pippa also seemed interested. However, they also appeared a little hesitant to actually hear about Curie's story, as it would surely involve elements of what was essentially bodily horror for the average community citizen. They looked over at Curie's black figure, most of them shifting in their seats slightly. Moore's nostrils flared. Pippa's ears twitched slightly. Quiss had seized almost any movement. But still, if Curie was going to speak up on their own account like this, nobody was going to stop them. In fact, everyone at the table got very quiet, concerned that any interruption now might dissuade the cyborg from continuing their explanation. However, it seemed that, just like James had done before them, Curie was waiting for a prompting to continue their retelling. A question or a pointer, something to give them a place to start. For James, even in their current situation, that was all about asking uncomfortable questions. The question that needed to be asked was one that he could not bring himself to utter. So it would have to be on somebody else to speak it into existence. In the end, it was Pippa, whose patience was the first to run out. "So, what were you like before your change?" she asked slowly, lacking her usual chipper energy, while her ears erratically twitched every few seconds. It was the only sensible question to ask. Everybody knew what change Curie had made. They also all knew why people weren't too happy about them changing, but somehow the question still seemed plain wrong. As was always the case with Curie, it was hard to immediately discern an emotion from their behaviour. Their reactions were a lot more subtle and drawn out than the usual facial shifts or instinctual movements that clued one in to the mental state of more average people. They took some time to answer, while the table fell silent once more. "Among my species, the Terraveld, there is a condition known simply as MEPIP." Curie's voice finally rang out, but to everyone's surprise, it didn't sound like Curie at all. The voice clearly came from them, but it wasn't the usual synthetic imitation that they were all used to. Instead, it was crystal clear, sounding like the recording of an organic voice speaking those sentences, instead of the creation of an artificial system recreating speech. "It occurs about once in every 100,000 births. Translated directly, it only means as much as chaotic, although that translation isn't quite fitting in the way it conveys that meaning." James sat on open mouth, trying to process what Curie was telling them while still trying to get over their vocal shift. He wasn't the only one having problems with that. All around, everybody seemed to be quite taken aback by the unfamiliar sound. Even those who should technically be a lot more comfortable with this voice than with Curie's usual one. Everyone who had one took a large swig of their drink. "The condition has a variety of effects, manifesting differently in every person affected by it. However, symptoms that are always present are a malformation of facial and bodily structure, resulting in a signature look for affected people. The genetic defect shortens the face and morphs the wings, rendering the affected individual flightless. It also affects the coordination of pattern formation on the skin, causing the affected individuals to display chaotic and unpredictable color patterns rather than the natural ones." Curie continued their explanation, either unperturbed by everyone's gawking, or gracefully ignoring it for the moment, as they outwardly showed no emotional sway. "Where the effects differ a lot, more is in the mental effects it has. Generally, affected individuals are observed to have a strong reduction in social capacity, as well as in sexual and romantic activity, and usually show behavioural self-effacement. However, there are a variety of effects observed in different affected individuals, making blanket statements about the condition's mental effects unreliable at best." To James, the explanation sounded like Curie had at some point memorized an article about the condition and was reciting the abstract to them. He also had trouble recontextualizing the fact that Curie's people apparently had wings, as well as colourful patterns in his head. Even though it was besides the point right now, he wondered what a Terraveld would look like. On his lap, Shida had by now turned onto her stomach, holding herself up with her elbows on his thighs and looking at Curie curiously. "Am I correct in the assumption that you are affected by this condition?" Moore spoke with the obvious, hesitantly, looking at Curie's metal surface with an almost stony expression. Curie didn't directly acknowledge her question, instead continuing with a different chapter of the necessary context for their story. Apart from the actual term for the condition, there is another word among my species for those affected by it, they said, the tone of the still wrong-sounding voice shifting slightly, as a hint of bitterness was detectable within it now. I will not dignify it by telling it to you, but a fitting translation would probably be icy beauties, due to what is most likely an error somewhere on our early brain development as a species. The deformities brought forth by the Mepid condition are generally seen as very attractive among the Terravelt, much to the detriment of the affected individuals, as the many suitors this tends to attract are a nuisance in the very best of cases. It did indeed sound like a cruel prank of nature, to make those the least interested in that kind of affection also the most desired targets for it. Although it also wasn't the first time James had heard of something like this. Everyone seemed to have similar thoughts to his, their faces turning thoughtful as their postures started to slouch down, as if keeping themselves upright would divert too much processing power from the topic at hand. Pippa especially seemed to have a hard time wrapping her mind around Curie of all people being a beloved beauty in their community. For years and years, I grew up being told about my beauty, being told about my exceptionality, and many chased after my affection. However, I could never see it. I didn't see my chaotic pattern as a thing of beauty. My deformed, useless wings were just that, useless appendages, deprived of their functionality. My face was just a face, Curie described, the reminiscing and melancholy clearly audible in their new voice, as their body kept standing perfectly still. After being told that I was beautiful for so long, I wanted to feel it, to feel what it was all of them saw in me. I didn't want to just be beautiful for them anymore, but also for me. So I searched for a change I would need to finally feel that elusive feeling. But every example of beauty I could find was just like me, a shell of a thing seemingly admired by all, while being either devoid or robbed of an actual function. James could see where this story was going by now, and he guessed so could everyone else. But while the conclusion he knew Curie must have come to was at least fairly understandable to him, it seemed to trouble other people at the table a lot more. In fact, given their apprehensive looks and strained postures, it seemed like he was the only one not outright dreading the moment Curie would confirm their suspicions. He could even feel Sheeta tense up, which shouldn't have surprised him as much as it did, given what had happened during their first encounter with Curie. In the end, I figured it out. I found the change I needed to make, Curie said, and a wave of genuine happiness, that he would probably never have expected to come out of them, washed over their voice. Beauty wasn't functionless chaos, it was precision, function, effectiveness. I had always had a fascination for machines, but only then when I was at my lowest did I see their true exceptionality shining through. Gladly, they now had reached the part of the story where James was once again comfortable with giving his own input. That way he could finally help ease the tensions in the room while also taking some of the pressure off of Curie. And did you make your enhancements yourself, or had you somebody do it for you? He asked, figuring it would probably be something that they might be quite happy to talk about. For the first time since they had started the explanation, Curie moved, shifting their body to look at James before freezing up again. I made them all myself. I had very specific thoughts about what I wanted to do and the way I wanted to achieve it, so it was only logical to do it myself, they explained, and in a reminiscing gesture, they left their forward arms as well as two of their backward legs, looking at one after the other methodically. I also don't think anyone would have done it for me, even if I asked them. James could basically see Moore's mouth opening and closing, and she seemed to be stopping herself from saying anything like, "Of course not," or anything similar. Quiz had, in a gesture seemingly imitating Curie, started looking down at their own hands. If James had to guess, they were wondering what in the world could push them so far to make them want to get rid of their limited appendages and replace them for something more functional. Pippa managed to hide the fact that the myth thought of the process of obtaining those enhancements caused her to be nauseous. But if you wanted functionality, why not give yourself working wings then? A question rang out into the room. James looked down at Sheeta, who, just like everyone else, seemed pretty uncomfortable with the thought itself, although apparently not enough to quench her curiosity. I did, at first, Curie admitted, taking another look at their long, crab-like legs. I wanted to regain my function. However, I quickly figured out that having been rooted to the ground my entire life, flying was not part of my function anymore. So I replaced it with more practically applicable motoric skills which are useful for my work. As if to demonstrate, the small tubes they use for dexterous manipulations emerged from their legs and aimlessly swayed through the air for a few seconds before retreating back. My new body allows for obsolete orders from my brain meant for removed motoric units to be redirected, giving me a much wider range of motions and abilities than I have had before. My home mouse legs, for example, are entirely controlled by what used to be the twitch of a toe, which I don't need anymore, Curie kept explaining, wiggling their toeless feet as if to emphasize their point. That is pretty amazing, James admitted, thinking about the implications. It must have taken a very long time to get a feeling for completely new movement patterns ingrained in one's brain. Then again, maybe it wasn't so different from learning to control a new machine, or maybe learning the controls of a video game, where most movement was also done with only the fingers. It is, isn't it? Curie replied happily, their cheerful tone being much easier to decipher in this strange new voice of theirs. However, what was also easy to notice was their tone shifting more and more into a dark foreboding as they continued talking. But that was not what the people back home thought. They couldn't see it like I saw it. Nobody I met could. I knew of the general view on the modification of one's body, of course, but back then, I'd never realized just how severe it is. Moore, Sheeda and Pippa alike guiltily averted their gazes, while Chris appeared to get lost in thought, leaving James to be the only one keeping his eyes fixed on those of Curie. I am no fool, Curie stated solemnly. I know that people are disgusted by my new body. I don't really blame them. Just like I could never see the things how they did, they now cannot see the things how I do, and I know many of them hate me for it. But still, I never once wanted to go back. I've decided that I would rather feel miserable because of other people than be miserable because of myself. You shouldn't have to be miserable at all, James mumbled. Their stance on things was admirable in a way, not holding on to hate and anger. However, he felt that it was unjust for them to have to be this accepting of such an unfair situation. The buzz he was still under didn't exactly help with that. Moore started, but the words seemed to die in her throat. Everyone else remained silent, trying not to look at Curie. I took the position as a researcher in the GES because it was an opportunity to do what I love, while staying reclusive from people, Curie added. However, I have to admit the decision turned out to be much better than expected for reasons that I could never have anticipated. And now I know finally that there are people out there able to see the world like I do. At least a little bit, and someday I want to see that world where people see the change of the body, maybe not as the beauty I see, but also not as something to be hated. That last part was fairly obviously directed at James, or maybe more precisely, humanity as a whole. He couldn't do much more but awkwardly smile and nod at that, not quite sure what to say after such a proclamation. The other people at the table also remained completely quiet. It probably was hard for them to think of something nice to say. I think this means it is my turn now, isn't it? Curie suddenly asked into the quiet. At that, everybody snapped back up and looked at them with surprise. Yeah, go ahead, Pippa spoke up, while everybody awaited Curie's question with anticipation. Curie's legs began to move in place, turning their body around without moving an inch from its current position, until they could comfortably focus at Sheeda, who confusedly looked up at them. I have a question for you, Sheeda, they stated, with a shift towards the sound of an earnest desire, or maybe even need to know something. Sheeda rolled around on James's legs, shifting her head left to right while eyeing Curie before saying, It's your turn, go ahead. Curie almost seemed to steel themselves before talking. I am under no illusion that you like me, they stated, already bringing their question off to a bad start. However, your behaviour towards me has been quite strange. Your statements usually indicate that you feel just as much disgust towards mechanical body replacements as the average person. However, different from the average person, you have never shown any hesitation to be around me or even make physical contact with me, while most average persons seem repulsed by those things. I want to know why that is. Weirdly, it almost sounded like an accusation rather than something that was a positive for Curie. Sheeda seemed to ponder that for a second. A finger wandered to her face, and she closed her eyes for a moment before taking a half-hearted whiff of the roots, and answering with a shrug. "You just don't register as a cyborg to me," she said, almost dismissively. "Maybe that would be different if I knew you before, but I didn't. Metal arms or metal legs or random bits of metal to fill holes in teeth, that stuff weirds me out. You just look like a robot. Robots aren't disgusting." She reached her arm out towards one of Curie's legs, playfully knocking against it with her knuckles, causing a metallic sound to ring out. Curie seemed to ponder that, seemingly having trouble following that reasoning. However, James understood completely. Out of sight, out of mind. That was the high-class Deathworlder way of dealing with problems that only existed in concept. "I see," Curie finally said slowly, before bringing the head back up. "Alrighty, since we are talking being weirded out, I've got another question for you, James," she had accused, seemingly purposely slowing her words as she talked, since she had just been able to speak normally only moments ago. "Right, in a moment," James said, holding his hand out to indicate for her to hold her thought. "But first, I'm sorry, but I have to ask, Curie, what is it with that voice?" That was in fact something that everyone seemed to wonder, as the gazes at Curie got even more interested now. Curie seemed confused for just a moment. Only after a few seconds it seemed to click for them. "Oh, right, you have never heard me use it," they said, and again the inflections of a sudden understanding were crystal clear. "This is a different voice generation method I use sometimes when interacting with strangers in a public setting. I personally don't like it as much as the other, since I have a lot less precise control over it. However, it seems to be less irritating for many people, so I keep it around. I also figured it would be more suited for storytelling." James had many questions to say the least, and he seemed to not be the only one. However, he also wasn't the only one who knew that asking those questions would most likely only result in more confusion, so he decided to, for now at least, just accept it. If he was being honest, in his current hazy state, he would in all likelihood not understand a single bit of information Curie would convey while actually trying to explain it to him. He had a hard enough time following them when he was sober, after all. "Alright, good to know," he merely mumbled, dazedly reaching for his head before adding, "So, you had a question, Sheeda?" Sheeda blinked a few times before seemingly also coming back to reality. Shaking out her hair, she briefly replied, "Yeah, since we were kinda on the topic already, I wanted to ask what was up with you earlier when you were talking to the matriarch." Moore looked at her confusedly and butted in. "What do you mean? Him and the matriarch were just talking." Pippa and Quiz, who had both not been present for the encounter with the Leader Supreme, turned their heads and interestedly listened to the exchange. "Don't tell me you didn't notice how uncomfortable he was," Sheeda said with a smack of her lips, giving more the same disapproving look that the old woman liked to hand out herself so much. "Uncomfortable?" Moore mused confusedly, putting her eyes off of Sheeda to inquisitively look at James instead. James let out a dull chuckle that lasted a bit longer than he'd liked, as he had a bit of trouble getting it back under control in his current state. Once he had finally managed to calm his breathing, he loudly and awkwardly cleared his throat. "Oh, that," he said, scratching the stubble on his cheek while avoiding eye contact. "It is a pretty silly story, really." Pippa, apparently already taken by the proposition of another Earth story, perked up her ears and eagerly stated, "Well, too bad. It's been asked, now you gotta deliver." James threw her a venomous glare, but based on the reactions of everyone else, he knew that he was fighting a losing battle. Sighing, he rolled his eyes and got ready to explain. "Well, when we were really young, back when things with our families were still preachy, Flynn, Nia and I went to visit her parents once, while they were still living in the territories neighbouring their home." He began the convoluted explanation of his own irrationality. "I was like 8 years old at the time. Earth years, of course. Anyway, most of the trip doesn't matter now, but one day we drove out to visit a remote village that decided to live off the grid, away from civilization and technology, so to speak. Don't know why they did it, but they seemed happy with it. So we hung out, learned a bit of the way they did things, and had a pretty good time overall. So good of a time, in fact, that we went out there again the next day." He looked around, seeing if everyone was following so far. Eager gazes told him to get on with it already. Now I should mention we have elephants on Earth. Big Proboscidea. A bit shorter than Moore, but way more massive. Those things are powerful, is what I'm saying, and smart too. They aren't like most animals, not exactly sapient, but when you look into their eyes, you can tell they're actually looking back, if you know what I mean. Or maybe that doesn't make sense, I don't know, he said. He was talking pretty fast, as he really wanted to get the story over with. Anyway, next day, when we were going back to that village, we were almost there already. Just had to cross one more hill when we would see it. Nia and I, being kids, of course ran on ahead, impatient to finally get there. And, well, that way we were the first to see it. His words stopped a bit in his throat, as he recounted something that he should probably not have seen at that tender age. "You were the first to see what?" Pippa asked nosily, apparently not quite understanding his pausing. "The destroyed village, of course," Sheeta hissed annoyedly in a reprimanding tone. "What?" Pippa asked surprisedly, looking at James for confirmation. James nodded. "Destroyed huts, dead bodies, loss of blood. That is all that I really remember. Luckily we were taken away before we got too good of a look at it," he explained, images of the bloody sand and the empty gazes of the corpses flashing through his mind. "Back then we were told that the village was destroyed by elephants. As a kid that made sense to me. I just remember the looks of the elephants I had seen in the village before, the judging eyes of those giants, telling me to better not get too close, and seeing the shit destruction that was left behind, it just stuck with me. To be completely honest, it is pretty silly. The older I got, the more I realised that the village was actually destroyed by bandits. They just told us it was elephants to shield us from the cruel reality of the situation, which I would rather not get into right now. However, even knowing that, the fear from back then has never quite let me go. I can't explain it. I doubt there is even an explanation. It usually doesn't matter. However, that is the reason the matriarch caught me off guard like that." "That is horrible," Maud mumbled, more to herself than to him, as one of her clawed hands rose towards her face. Pippa seemed to have choked on the foot she had put in her mouth because she remained silent. "Well, a better explanation than what I came up with," she had mused, no further specifying what exactly she had in mind. "Alright, change of topic," James loudly proclaimed, really not wanting to talk about this anymore. He had plenty of time to talk this through with plenty of therapists before, and since she was so graciously volunteering as target for his ire, he focused in on Pippa. "Since you seem to be so interested in our lives, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?" Even in his inebriated state, he managed to combine the question with a fairly predatorial glare while he mischievously smirked at their marsupial. "Oh, well, I guess," the address nervously spoke up, her ears standing up straight and pointing straight towards James. "Although you guys' lives really make mine seem plain boring in comparison." "Well, you've been asked, so you better deliver," Sheeta cued amusedly, while slowly starting to settle back down into a more comfortable position once again. James leaned back, supporting himself with one hand on the table, while the other found something to do in slowly stroking through Sheeta's hair. Pippa visibly swallowed. "Well, really not much to say. I come from a big family, being one of 12 girls and 14 boys back home. Needless to say, things got pretty cluttered at times," she said, her hands starting to fidget with each other as she spoke. "To be completely honest, with 25 siblings, things were probably more cramped out of the pouch than they were inside. It got pretty claustrophobic at times and life wasn't exactly luxurious. And being cooped up like that all the time made me want to get out. See the world, you know. So as soon as I could, I took the opportunity and got a job as a paramedic away from the family. Don't get me wrong, I love them to bits, but that life just wasn't for me. Away from home, I may not have had a lot, but if you're used to sharing with 20 people, not a lot is still a considerable amount. Then things happened, and I ended up getting the chance to go to space. Of course, I jumped at the opportunity. Now, whenever I get home, I got some new crazy stories to tell everybody, and I'm the favourite aunt ever of all the little ones." She sighed, reminiscing once her explanation was over. "I miss the little ones," she lamented for a moment, almost longingly staring into the distance. Then her expression changed as she seemed to get a bit brooding. Finally, she shifted her gaze over at Moore and nosily asked, "Come to think of it, with you having 3 kids and 3 guys back home, what made you decide to explore the great expanse more?" James perked up at that. That was a good question. He also didn't miss Quiss throwing a cheeky glance over at Moore, one that indicated that they already knew the answer. It made him wonder how well these two actually knew each other, although it seemed to be a pretty old friendship to him. "Oh well, it is simple really," Moore said, sounding amused, although James couldn't help but feel that she also appeared to be getting the slightest bit flustered at the question. "My children have all left the herd already. They all chose a life more in tune with the community than I have led, and to be quite honest, while I certainly still enjoy their company, I am simply too old to be very interested in their fathers anymore.
They have all by now set their sights on some younger women, I am sure of it. So once my youngest was ready for the world, I was a bit at a loss as to what to do with myself. Starting to work again was just the natural next step for me."
Apparently, Moore wasn't one for retirement. James could have probably guessed that, but it was somehow still a revelation. With that revelation, another thing came to mind. His eyes shifted on the quiz. The last of the group who had yet to talk about themselves. Of course, it was Moore's turn to ask something, so he would have to hold back for now. However, Moore seemed to be able to read his mind at that moment. He probably wasn't very subtle in his staring if he had to guess.
"Well, Quiz, would you like to tell us about yourself as well?"
the large woman cheerily said, raising her glass at her small friend. Quiz returned the gesture and slowly let some of the dark liquid flow into their mouth before putting the glass back down. "It takes so long to explain things in sign," Quiz lamented for a moment, or shaking out their body. As James felt the typical shivers run down his spine, you could see Quiz take a look at him. "You know, you really don't have to flinch every time I move, James." They signed towards him with slow, explicit movements. James winced at being called out like that. "I'm really sorry," he said honestly, briefly bowing his head to them. "It's not on purpose, I swear." He should have expected that they noticed it, however it still felt worse actually knowing for sure. "I guess the fact that a human is afraid of me, of all people, is something I could tell my grandchildren someday, if it wasn't for the fact that I will never have any," Quiz replied, letting out their croaking laugh. James also chuckled at that. "I'll keep it short, or we will still be sitting here tomorrow," Quiz signed. And seeing as they had most likely passed midnight by now, tomorrow was quite a while away. "I have been among the stars for most of my life. I have been around all kinds of people and have seen all kinds of places. You all have your stories back home that somehow led to you being here. For me, being here is my story. It has been for many years, and it will be until I die. I will not deny that even I can't help but be unsure of this new chapter in my life with all you around. However, I'd say it is a good thing that I can still find some excitement, even after having seen this much." That was a strangely human thing to say, found James. And because of that, he let himself get swept up in it a bit, raising his glass, for which he needed both hands, and loudly proclaiming, "Well, I'll drink to that," before downing the final rest of his drink. His friends joined him in his sentiment, even if it was only with water in 2 cases, and a general sound of clanks filled the air as one glass after another was set back down. James wiped his mouth clean with his arm. "All right," he said loudly, looking into the round. "Who's in for another round?" Slowly, Konglorch stomped over the walkway for large creatures. People hurried out of his way as heavy thuds rang out with each step his mighty front legs took. For a place called the Great Community Station, this sure was dull. The usual mixture of plateless cowards littered the halls. The usual number of tiny competitors either scurried away or fearfully glanced at his majestic form. Nothing about this place was great. It was just as much of a bore-fest as any other community-owned station. He really needed some excitement. Either that or something to take his mind off of things. Independently, all 4 of his eyes moved, searching the halls for anything that might be more interesting than just keeling over, dead. Finally, attracted by some familiar sounds from one direction, one of them glimpsed something, causing all 4 to focus in on the new sight. The sign of the bar in front of him read, "A Guviad Shade," and the tunes of a familiar song softly rang out from inside, dulled by the walls. Well, this would have to do for now, he thought, as he neared the large doors, which only opened for him, as he stepped so close that the door took up nearly his entire field of vision. As soon as it had opened, the volume of the music increased by an order of magnitude, and the striking smell of intoxicating chemicals filled his Moran nostrils. It was strong enough that he could taste the alcohol in the air. At least this promised enough intoxication to forget his boredom for a while. As he entered, many eyes fell on him for a moment, and the usual tension his presence caused set in with some of the patrons. However, to his surprise, something else within the room seemed to have already taken the people's attention to such a degree, that even his appearance seemed to be nothing more than a footnote to many. Oh, he thought, could it be that fate has led me to something interesting yet? From his position, he could not see what it was that held the people here enraptured by his presence. However, he now was convinced that it would be his destiny, given duty, to find out. He made his way through the room. Even though they were distracted, people still got out of his way once they noticed him getting too close. It was good that they knew their place, even now. Finally, he arrived at a table, which was in a position that allowed him a good view over most of the room. Holding his head high above most others in the room, his eyes once more started to scan the space around him, erratically moving in all directions. Quickly, he at least got an idea of what it was that had the people this on edge, that not even a tonobsterite entering the scene seemed to be of much concern to him. The net weight of Deathworlders in the room seemed to be unusually high, as there was a Miat as well as one of those rodents from Tshirt, whose name he kept forgetting, present. To his surprise, the rodent sat alone at a table, eyeing the other Deathworlder distrustfully, while the Miat seemed to be having company. And unusual company indeed. What could have motivated a bunch of prey to search the company of a Deathworld predator? And why was said Deathworld predator tolerating their presence like this? A Miat especially would be the last species he expected to flaunt around with a bunch of platelets. However, the answers to these questions only interested him superficially. Much more important was that a Miat around could mean some serious entertainment for him. He had heard they were ferocious, even if they were only reached up to his torso. Deciding to forego ordering for now, he stepped away from his table again, starting towards the one currently occupied by the strange group. As was to be expected from something forged by survival, the feline's ears immediately twitched in his direction as he took his first heavy steps forward. The sheer amount of Mrfaye's residue littering the table around them was a clear sign that they already had quite the night. However, even that inebriation wasn't enough to completely dull their survival instincts. Their heads shot around, and piercing eyes fixated him sharply in their gaze. Yes, this was someone not to be trifled with. He could feel it. He could feel his heartbeat accelerating, his twin hearts beating nearly in unison at this point. His hind legs almost started to scrape the ground in excitement, but he could contain himself. The mere sudden change in demeanour now also clued their company in to the fact that something must have been amiss. They also turned towards him. Only the Raphaelites stood on one level with him, their brown eyes wide in surprise as one of the horizontal pupils finally focused in on him. The rest of the company consisted of an Andalia and a strange jet black being he couldn't place. Was it a robot? Why would anyone bring a robot to a bar? The red eyes of the strange thing were now also directed at him, causing a strange feeling in his gut. The Miat showed no direct signs of aggression as he neared, simply fixating him the whole time, carefully noting every move he made. The conversation at the table had died down. Nobody said a thing. When he stepped even closer, the feline's tail came into motion. Where it had merely softly swayed left to right before, it now started waving through the air. The hairs in their body also started to stand up. He wondered if that was just his appearance causing that reaction, or if maybe they could sense his intentions already. They were rumoured to be quite perceptive, after all. Oh well. If they were here with friends, he believed he knew exactly the kind of words that could get him an even stronger reaction. "A Miat in a place like this," he said in a raspy voice, each of his four eyes narrowing down on his target. "One would believe that this is not the place for a Deathworlder." The companions wary glanced at their strange acquaintance, as the address slowly rose from their slouching position on the table. It was clear from their movements that the influence of the drugs had not left them completely unaffected. In fact, Conglorch could even hear it in their voice as they challengingly responded, "Why don't you come over here and say that's my face?" Hushed, the platelets around them talked among themselves, and even tried to dissuade the feline from taking his challenge, but they didn't matter. He ignored the vermin. Right now, his challenge stood before him. He had not yet faced a Miat. However, he was of course aware of the stories. He wondered if this tiny being could actually give him as much of a challenge as the rumours would make him believe. He doubted it. Horror stories from platelets had no doubt mixed with the actual recollections of their feats. But still, he could not deny his excitement as he stepped closer, taking them up on their offer. In a single elegant movement, the Miat had bounced off the table, landing on the floor with their 2 feet and staring up at him. He held eye contact with them. What would be going on in the mind of such a small competitor, staring up at a mighty Pwntatochip, the greatest of all predators, he wondered. The mighty maulers at the end of his front legs scratched over the ground. Each of them were bigger than the Miat's entire head. However, they didn't even regard them, focusing completely on his face. If they didn't keep their eyes on his weapons, this would be over quicker than he wanted it to. He waited for the first sign of doubt in their eyes, he would use it as his signal to attack. However, as the tiny predator regarded him, there was no doubt. He of course expected such from an experienced fighter. However, in his place, he didn't find what he expected to see. There was no confidence, no assuredness of victory, no expectations of a fight. The only thing he found in those yellow eyes was emptiness. The entire body language of the being oozed aggression, from the waving tail to the standing hairs, but their eyes didn't. To him, it was indescribable. Their eyes narrowed down and focused on him, and he was sure that he should see something in them, be it cold calculation or burning fury. But instead, they were a dark emptiness, threatening to swallow him whole. The feeling of bugs crawled over him that slowly spread over each of his plates, became ever more present in his mind, and brought with it the realization that maybe he had miscalculated. This would definitely be a great challenge. The Miat must have seen the doubt in his eyes, as they took it as a sign of opportunity, just like he had wanted to. Kongloj braced for an attack. However, the Miat's movement was stopped in its tracks, as their head was pulled back, and they let out a pained, "Hey, ouch!"